Howdy. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Roman Papaduke, and I'm the Executive Director of the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation. It is my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Kay and Britt Rice Lecture Series. The purpose of the lecture series is to bring to the Texas A&M campus prominent experts and central figures in current issues of public interest. Before we begin our program, I'd like to acknowledge Kay and Britt Rice for their generous support of this lecture series and for their overall support of the Bush Library Center. I'm happy they were able to join us tonight, and I'd like to acknowledge them by having them stand. Please, Kay and Britt. Tonight's lecture is being presented by Mr. Tom DeFrank, author of the recently published Write It When I'm Gone, which covers a series of private interviews with President Gerald Ford conducted over the course of 16 years. His lecture will focus on that book this evening. Tom is the Washington bureau chief of the New York Daily News and was Newsweek's White House correspondent for a quarter century and deputy chief of the magazine's Washington bureau for 12 years. First assigned by Newsweek to Vice President Ford in 1973, he became one of 7 journalists to travel regularly with Ford aboard Air Force Two during the final months of Watergate, and then covered Ford's presidency from start to finish. DeFrank was also a member of Ford's hand-picked Air Force One pool the day he left office in 1977, and they remained in close contact over the years when they had the private conversations detailed in his book. DeFrank was the last reporter to interview Ford in May 2006 and the last to visit him in November 1996, 6 weeks before his death. DeFrank is co-author of 3 previous books: James A. Baker III's The Politics of Diplomacy, Ed Rollins's Bare Knuckles and Back Rooms, and Newsweek's behind-the-scenes book At the Clinton-Bush Race, Quest for the Presidency, 1992. He won the Gerald R. Ford Prize for distinguished reporting on the presidency in 2006, and in 2007 was cited by the White House Correspondents Association for his exclusive reporting and analysis. Tom is a graduate of Texas A&M, so this is kind of a homecoming for him, and is a former editor of the Battalion. Following his presentation, there will be a question and answer period. Those of you who would like to pose a question to Tom could do so by using the microphones that are in the aisles to the front of the auditorium. In addition, following our program, there will be a book signing. Tom's new book will be available, and I understand it's making the New York Times bestseller list this coming weekend, so get it while it's hot. Makes great Christmas presents. On another note, I'd like to welcome our guests that are viewing us tonight. This is our first live webcast of one of our programs here at the Bush Library Center. So welcome to all of those who are watching this live webcast. And on a personal note, I would like to just mention that I had the pleasure of working with Tom when I worked for Ford at the White House. Tom, of course, covered the White House at that time as a correspondent. I've always found Tom to be tough but fair, challenging and engaging, but above all, a true professional, and I regard him as a friend. Tom?
Howdy. Roman, thank you very much for the typically overly generous introduction. Roman knows better. I suspect there are a few old friends in the audience here who know better as well. There's somebody else who knows better. His name is George W. Bush. I suspect his father definitely knows better too, but that's a long story. But in 1999, when Governor Bush was campaigning for president, he and I was on a trip with him in Massachusetts, and he saw me and he introduced me to the governor of Massachusetts as Tom DeFrank, a good man for his ilk. Well, I knew what he meant. He was thinking ilk, not good, that's for sure. But the fact is, a good man for his ilk is delighted to be back home. For those of us who attended this wonderful place, coming home is never enough, and I'm delighted to be here, and I'm especially glad to be here because I committed a pretty grievous sin recently. I had to pass up my 40th class reunion 2 weeks ago to appear on Meet the Press touting my book. And I got it. The reason I had to do it was I had a contractual arrangement with the publisher of the book that required me to do it, but most of my classmates were understanding, but one was not. He sent me an email saying, sucking up to the media elite. What has happened to you? So I guess I plead guilty on that one, but as I said, I had a contractual agreement. But so that this assuages my guilt a little bit, but it's always wonderful to be home, and I appreciate the invitation from Roman, who, forget about what he said about me, but that business about the true professional is, that could be Roman talking about himself. He's much too modest to talk about himself, but Roman is, as far as I'm concerned, the gold standard of government public affairs officials, and Texas A&M and the Bush Library are really lucky to have him. So thanks, Roman. I'm glad to be here. I want to talk a little bit about my book, but I also want to talk a little about someone else who knew that that is not an introduction I so richly deserve, and that is Gerald R. Ford, our 38th president. I was in Grand Rapids yesterday. I spoke at the Ford Museum there, and we had a great time. It was very nice, but I must say the hardest time for me personally was going to his gravesite yesterday, because I've not been there since his burial, and all I can say is I'm glad that I was there by myself. It was a fairly poignant moment, because I really owe President Ford an awful lot. He was extraordinarily generous to me for more than three decades, actually a third of a century. Not just starting in 1991, which is the genesis for these interviews that form the core of this book, but also from the moment I started covering him in the fall of 1973. My boss called me in and said, "Nixon is finished. Ford's going to be president. I don't know when, but it's going to happen. I want somebody who knows Ford, who knows his people, and vice versa, so that when he becomes president, Newsweek will be taken care of." And I was thrilled, of course. I was 28 years old, from Arlington, Texas, and I had not become jaded. I had not become immersed in the reality that while the White House is an extremely prestigious assignment, the glamour factor is highly overrated. But I was thrilled. And, of course, for the next 8 months, that's what I did. I traveled with Gerald Ford. He traveled 125,000 miles in 8 months as vice president, 41 states in 37 weeks. He was as peripatetic as anyone I have ever covered. And that's the basis of, that's where the relationship began. And of course, had he not given me a fateful interview in April of 1974 in Palm Springs, California, which I talk about in chapter 1, and I'll talk about in just a minute, I would not be here tonight, and this book, Write It When I'm Gone, would not have been written. Now, a few of you may know that President Ford had a modest connection with Texas A&M himself. On May the 11th, 1974, amidst the carnage of the Watergate crisis, Vice President Ford spoke at the A&M commencement and gave a very reassuring talk that basically said our democracy was still strong and resilient, and we were going to be fine no matter whatever happened with Watergate. He never mentioned Watergate. He never mentioned Nixon, but that was the message, and he was right about that. This is a strong and enduring and resilient democracy, and that was his message that day 33 years ago. By coincidence, I was here on campus with him the day he spoke, thrilled to be back covering the man my boss was convinced would be the next president. Now, a couple of days before Vice President Ford arrived on campus, a reporter from the battalion called to interview me about Ford. And in the course of that conversation, I said that I didn't know if he was going to be president, but if he were to become president, he would be sufficiently equipped to handle the job. Well, the day before we arrived at Easterwood Airport, the battalion ran a story with a headline that went a little too far. I mean, it's not the first time that a reporter has been tripped up by a headline that doesn't quite match the story. The headline in the Bat that day said, "DeFrank predicts Ford presidency," which is not exactly what I said. Big two-column headline on the front of the battalion. Well, one of my friends commandeered a couple of dozen copies after we got here on campus, and when we got back on Air Force 2 after Ford's speech to fly to Houston for a political event, there was a copy of the battalion on every seat on Air Force Two. The press sat in front of that airplane, not in the back like today on Air Force One or Air Force Two. And so when Vice President Ford got on the airplane, my very dear friend Phil Jones of CBS hopped up with a copy of the battalion, and he said, "Mr. Vice President, there's a story here in the local press that I think you will find of interest." He grabbed the thing, he saw the headline, and he winced. And he read no further because he knew he was in trouble. And he said to me, I'll never forget him saying, "Tom, you're going to get me in big trouble." And he grumbled at me, and he hurried past the press compartment back to his safe section in the back. But the truth is, he was a good sport about it, as he was a good sport about just about everything. And later on, he signed a copy of the battalion right across the headline that said, "DeFrank predicts Ford presidency." It's probably the tersest autograph I have from him. It says, "Thanks, Jerry Ford." But I have it, and maybe someday I'll give it to the archives here at A&M because it's one of my favorite stories. Now, earlier this year, my very good friend and classmate from the class of '67, Eddie Joe Davis, graciously invited me to speak at one of our commencements. It was, as I said at the time, the honor of a lifetime, made even more special for me by the fact that I spoke 32 years to the very day that Ford had delivered the commencement here, and I was with him. That was not the first time or the last time that fate has injected itself with some drama and serendipity into the relationship I was fortunate to have with Gerald Ford. And several of those incidents can be found in the book. I want to talk just a little bit about the methodology of the book because it has gotten a little attention in the media from other journalists. And the methodology, I'll grant you, is unique, but it's certainly not at all unprecedented. As I said earlier, the core of this book is 16 years of off-the-record interviews that I had with him beginning in August of 1991 and continuing until 5 months before his death on December 26th of last year. There were multiple inspirations for the idea. Basically, though, the idea was I wanted to come see him every year and do an obituary interview with him every year for the rest of his life, however long that was. And the proposal I made to him was I won't print any of it until he was dead. He thought about this for 2 or 3 days. He never said, "Why would you want to do that?" He just thought about it, and then he said, yes. Some days I think he just did it because I asked him, because that was the kind of guy he was. Some people say, well, obviously he thought he could manipulate you from the grave and settle score from the graves. He didn't have a vengeful bone in his body. He was not that kind of guy. I think it was just he thought it was an interesting idea, and it would give him a chance to be a little more candid. But I'll come back to that in a little bit. Part of my inspiration for this proposal was the whole institution of the obituary article. Any journalist can tell you that news organizations have hundreds, and in some cases thousands, of obits pre-written on the shelf, ready to go in the unfortunate instance of some prominent person's passing. Because just like all manner of news happens at 2 in the morning, it happens on the weekend, and sometimes it involves the death of individuals. And so, as I said, every news organization has got obituaries ready to go. But some news organizations, notably the New York Times, have taken the obituary to a higher level. The New York Times likes to offer people obituary interviews in their lifetime. And basically the idea is we want to come interview you in life so that we can include what you say to us in the article we'll print on your death. And you'll like it. You won't be able to see it, but you'll like it, and it'll make for a better story. And it's amazing how many individuals approached by the New York Times this way like that idea a lot. It gives you kind of a chance to say something about what they're going to write about you. So I knew that was well known in journalism circles, and so that was in the back of my mind. As I said, this is very standard. I should have told you earlier one of my favorite stories. About a year after President Reagan left office, he had water on his brain, and so he had to have emergency surgery at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. This was announced on a Friday. I got a frantic call from my boss. I was traveling with Bush 41 someplace, and I was told, you got to come in the office first thing tomorrow and write an obit for Reagan in case he doesn't survive this operation. And I said, wait a minute, I know we had an obit in the can. And I mentioned the name of the writer who I knew had written this obit, and my boss said, well, yeah, you're right about that. He had a really good 10,000-word piece written, but he didn't like it, so he erased it a week ago. So we had nothing. So I came in on a Saturday morning, and I wrote 3,000 words off the top of my head for an obit, which happily didn't run because Ronald Reagan lived at least another dozen years. But that's just all part of the obituary culture in journalism. So all of that was on my mind. But of course, I would have to say that my decision to ask him to do these interviews was very much influenced by the experience I had with him in April of 1974 in Palm Springs. It's a very long story, but I can make it a lot shorter. My first son had just been born, and I'd been my wife's whole pregnancy, I'd been gone traveling with Ford. And he was very solicitous about that, but when our first son was born, I knew I had to spend a little time at home, and so I missed the first 5 days of President Ford's trip to California. This was a very dynamic time in the middle of Watergate, where the Supreme Court was doing things, Leon Jaworski, the independent counsel, was doing things, Woodward and Bernstein were writing a story every 2 or 3 days, dropping some new bombshell. And so to be away from the guy I was covering for 5 days was an eternity, and I was, as Roman can tell you, fairly neurotic even at the age of 28. And so I wanted a catch-up interview with him, so I called his press secretary and asked if I could see him right away, because we were going to Monterey, California the next morning, and I knew there wouldn't be any time for 2 or 3 days. I wanted to see what was on his mind. Ford very graciously said, sure. So I flew to Palm Springs, got off the plane, went right to the hotel. Without checking into my hotel, I went up to his staff office where he had just come in from a round of golf, and I will always remember he had a light blue Munsingwear shirt on with a little penguin on the pocket, and he was wearing very unstylish white socks. I still remember the white socks. But he was very gracious. He was very solicitous about my wife, our newborn son, and it really didn't start out as an interview, but it became one over time. And then towards the end of this interview, something happens that reporters dream of, and if you're lucky, it happens a couple of times in a career. His press secretary left to take a phone call and didn't come back. Just the two of us. No handlers. Apologies, Roman, but you know what I mean. And what I didn't know was for the last 5 days, Ford had been stewing about something. William Safire, the New York Times columnist who was very close to Nixon, had written a column, and its headline was "Et tu, Jerry?" ? And basically Safire accused Ford of disloyalty to Nixon by speculating about how a Ford administration might be different from a Nixon administration. And it was interesting because in our little interview before this incident happened, Ford said to me, I don't expect to be president. I don't want to be president. I'm going home to Grand Rapids in January of 1977. I believe Nixon will survive. I don't believe he's committed an impeachable offense. And it bugs me that people think that I'm interested in being president. I'm not. He was very emphatic about that. So right at the end of this interview, I get up to leave. I'm standing up, and Ford says, put your notebook away. And he says, I want to show you something, and I want to know what you think about this. And he hands me a piece of paper, and it's this Safire column written 5 days before that he's still stewing about. Just by coincidence, since I'd been behind on my work reading, I'd put together a reading file, and I had just read this Safire column a couple of hours before on the airplane coming out from Washington. And he was very upset. Accusing Ford of disloyalty to Nixon was a real hot button for him. He felt like he was one of Nixon's oldest friends. Nixon had come to the House in 1946. Ford had come to the House in 1948. They were good friends, he thought. And he also thought he'd bent over backwards trying to be loyal to the friend who had named him vice president. So to be accused by a Nixon loyalist of disloyalty had really unhinged him. And I didn't know any of this. So he shows me this, and he's really upset. He's uncharacteristically upset. He was a very mild-mannered, even-tempered guy. It was once said of Ford, he did have a temper, but he was 2%. He was 98% koala bear and 2% grizzly, and the problem was you never knew when that 2% was going to come roaring out of the chair and grab you by the throat. This day, he was really upset. And he really pressed me for an opinion about why Sapphire had written this. Now, I think it's a terrible idea for reporters to give people they cover advice. I think it's absolutely inappropriate. And I don't think it's a great idea to offer an opinion either. And these days I just don't do this. But he was really pressing me. He was very upset. He wanted an answer. He kept saying, I want to know what you think about this. He said, Dick Nixon knows that I've been damned loyal to him. And I don't understand why Sapphire did this. I don't understand why Nixon let him do it. Why are they doing this? Really pressing me. And so I blurted out. I said, well, Mr. Vice President, I think it's pretty obvious. They all know Nixon's finished. They know he can't survive, and they know you're going to be president. And Ford blurted out without thinking, you're right. But when the pages of history are written, nobody can say I contributed to it. Well, I hadn't been a reporter for that long, but I knew that was a thunderbolt, and so did he. And like every politician from the dawn of civilization who has gotten caught saying something he wished he or she hadn't said, he tried to take it back. You didn't hear that. That was off the record. I didn't mean that. It came out wrong. I mean, he's backing and filling furiously, and he's trying to get me just to forget that I had heard it. And I didn't say anything. And I think in thinking back on it, and I've had lots of time to think about this incident, obviously, in the 33 years that I sat on it, I think he inferred from my silence that I was thinking about using it, when in fact all he should have inferred from my silence was I was scared to death. He was a big, tall guy. He could have been a professional football player, and he was very upset at the notion that I might use this, because we both knew how incendiary that would be in the middle of Watergate. So he comes around the table, and he doesn't threaten me really, but he very gently grabs my tie. And he says, Tom, you're not leaving this room until we have an understanding. And I knew what the understanding was, of course. The understanding was he wanted me to tell him that I wasn't going to print this. And I froze. I was truly petrified. I was 28 years old. I've been yelled at by presidents and vice presidents since, and I have lived long enough to be able to tell the story to my two beautiful grandchildren when they get a little bit older. So I think I wouldn't be as intimidated today as I was in April of 1974. But I froze. And this was the first inkling I ever had that Gerald Ford was smarter than the stereotype that Democrats always like to put out about him, about not being very bright, because he had a very smart solution. He just said to me, write it when I'm dead. And I was so relieved that I didn't say, well, I better check with my boss or anything. I just surrendered. I said, okay. And he stuck his hand out. We shook hands. And from the moment we shook hands, it's like it never happened. He walks me to the door. The press secretary appears at the door, none the wiser. And Ford says, great to see you, Tom. We were worried about your wife. We heard it was a difficult delivery. I hope she's okay. I hope your son is okay. You coming with me to Monterey tomorrow? We'll have a good time. I'm playing golf with Arnold Palmer at Pebble Beach. It's like this never happened. Never happened. I gave him my word. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I think I should have. But the bottom line is I gave him my word, and I wasn't going to surrender my name and good word by breaking my word. So I kept that promise to him. And then 17 years later, when he was well into retirement, I proposed this obituary interview idea to him. He accepted, and we began those interviews in August of 1991. Why did I propose it? Well, I thought he would be more candid, or at least I hoped he would be. I'd heard over the years, for instance, that he was still angry with Reagan over the 1976 election. And I'd see him every year in retirement, and I'd ask him about Reagan, and he'd give me some canned, happy talk. Well, we don't have a lot in common, but we see him, we're friendly, we exchange phone calls. He calls on my birthday, I call on his birthday. And I kept hearing from other people, don't buy that baloney, he hates the guy. And so I figured there was another story there, and there was probably other things that he felt strongly about. And so I was hoping he might be more candid. And I think if you read the book, I think you'll probably agree. If you compare this book to his memoir, A Time to Heal, I think the level of candor by President Ford is far greater than in his memoir. He talks about the Clintons, both of them. He talks about Ronald and Nancy Reagan. He talks about Richard Nixon and Watergate. He expresses some regrets about Watergate. He talks about his protege, Dick Cheney, and it was pretty clear by the end of his life that he was, even though he loved Dick Cheney, he was biting his lip about Cheney towards the end of his life. But he talks a lot about himself. There's been a lot of press attention to what he says about the Clintons and the Reagans and the Nixons. But he also talks about himself, and there's a real human side to Gerald Ford in this book. He talks about worrying about getting prostate cancer because his PSA score is going up and that he can't get it down. He talks about how miserable he felt one night when he fell down and he couldn't get up, and he was on the floor for 45 minutes until a Secret Service agent happened just to wander by and see him. He talks about his frustrations with the computer. I plead guilty to leading the witness on this one. I always used to tease him because I'd go out and see him and I'd never see a computer. And I'd say, "Are you resisting the computer age?" And he'd say, "Well, I'm not good at this." He said, "Betty's a whiz and my grandchildren are great." And he said, I'm not into it. But I gave him enough grief about it politely, I guess, that one year, about 5 years ago, he said, "Next time you're here, I'm going to have a laptop so I don't have to hear this from you again." And so 6 months later, when I see him, he has a brand new laptop. And I said, "Well, I see you've got a laptop." He said, "Yeah, it's one of these new ones." And I said, "Who makes it?" He says, very proudly, he says, "It's a Microsoft." So he knows about computers. He talks about the O.J. Simpson trial. He talks about his advice to friends who are thinking about straying. It's really one of the more hilarious conversations in the entire book. He talks a lot about growing old, and I guess I was able to have a unique vantage point of watching him deal with the juggernaut of old age in the last 3 or 4 years of his life. And there's all kind of other little human touches. One of my favorite stories was the day about 3 years ago. I said, "Mr. President, I picked up a story the other day and I want to ask you about this." I said, "I heard that when you were a young congressman from Michigan, and every time you would go to the White House when President Truman was president, and you did this subsequently, I'm told that you used to stuff your pocket with matchbooks, dozens of matchbooks, and you take them home to Grand Rapids and hand them out as party favors to your constituents. Is that true?" And he gets a little flush, and he's nervous about this, and he says, "Well," he says, "maybe over the years I took a couple now and then." But he was legendary for doing that. As a matter of fact, in the last year of his presidency, a reporter, not me, was invited to Camp David for something, and this reporter was caught by President Ford stuffing his pockets with Camp David matchbooks. And Ford just saw this and smiled benignly because he had seen that movie himself. He had starred in that movie, I suppose. So there's all kind of human touches in the book that I think go well beyond the news notes here. Sometimes I am asked of the seven presidents I've covered, which one was my favorite, and I always say reporters are not in the business of having favorites. They shouldn't have favorites. That's the wrong way to look at what needs to be a relationship of some professional distance. I always say I look at it in terms of which president was the most fun to cover. And I always say that Bush 41 was the most fun to cover, but not out of any ideological reasons, but because of his unpredictability. You never knew where he was going to go. You never knew what he was going to do. You never knew what he was going to say. You never knew how the words were going to come tumbling out of his mouth. Clearly a genetic pass-through there from father to son. But I also say the most fun I've ever had covering presidents was covering a vice president, not a president, and it was Gerald Ford in those magical, mystical months on that tiny little twin-engine prop jet. an airplane that was so slow, we called it Slingshot Airways. It was an airplane that had such limited range that he couldn't fly to California without refueling someplace. But it was a wonderful time flying that tiny little airplane. And one of the sidelights of the book was I tracked down that airplane to see if it was in a scrapyard someplace. In fact, it's still flying 53 years after it came off a assembly line in San Diego. And in the May of next year, it's going to start fighting forest fires for the province of Saskatchewan. And sometime before its first flight, I'm going to go up to British Columbia, where it is now, just to take one last look at that airplane that has so many very fond memories for me, because a lot of historic things happened on that airplane, and I spent a lot of time with Vice President Ford on that airplane in a very difficult time. It was the most fun I've ever had in my life. This book is not a biography. It's not a analysis of his presidency. There are a couple of good books out there. I didn't want to do a dull, plodding, heavy, analytical book. I wanted to do what might be irreverently called Conversations with Jerry. Two guys who'd known each other for a long time, just talking and getting him to talk about people, places, and momentous things that he had seen and been involved in a long and remarkable political career. But there's a lot of humanity in the book, as I said earlier. My last interview with him was in May of last year, as Roman has told you. And this interview was interesting because it was followed by our first lunch. Somebody said, well, obviously you were a close personal friend of President Ford. And I always say, I don't think he thought that, and I know I didn't think that. It's not good for reporters to have personal friendships. I think we had a strong professional relationship, but we weren't friends, and the evidence of that is it took me 32 years to finally get an invitation to lunch with President Ford. And it was a wonderful, it was a nice interview, but he was starting to be a little less lucid than he had been. It was a good interview, but it was a wonderful lunch. But the most poignant, powerful moment of that encounter in May of 2006 was Mrs. Ford came to the door of his study where we were talking and said, it's time for lunch. And he said, are you ready, Mother? And she said, whenever you are, dear. And he said, good, let's have breakfast. I mean dinner. And then we adjourned for lunch. It was a very powerful human moment. But it was a wonderful lunch. And she came. Mrs. Ford came. So this was a threesome. And it wasn't, at some point I pulled out a notebook because it was just too rich and wonderful. But it was sentimental, very sentimentally laden. We were talking about the good old days, the bad old days, Air Force Two, reporters trying to see whether something he said on a given day in Cleveland was a signal that he was breaking with Nixon for the first time. We talked about that. We talked about our kids. We talked about our grandchildren. We talked about just about everything except, and a little bit of journalism. And what I remember most about that lunch was just how angry he was at his doctors. When I had seen him, I walked in for the interview and I said, how are you, Mr. President? And his first words were, the damn doctors won't let me swim anymore. He was really angry. This was a man who swam laps twice a day, every day, into his 90s until the doctors grounded him. And he couldn't understand what it was that made the doctors say he can't even dog paddle in the pool. I think, frankly, it hastened his demise, frankly, because the swimming and the exercise was so central to his persona. But he says to me at one point over lunch, he says, you know, the doctors don't want us to go to Colorado. And I said, so what are you going to do? He said, we're going anyway, damn it. He was in full revolt for what I call the medical Torquemadas, who were pushing him around, and he didn't like it one bit. Dessert was served. It was vanilla ice cream with strawberries and raspberries. And he says to me with a twinkle in his eye, you know, he said, we still have a little butter pecan ice cream around here. Now, that was his favorite dessert. There was a time that Air Force One never left a tarmac anywhere in the world without a couple of gallons of butter pecan in the freezer, because you never knew when he was going to want some. It was especially true if Mrs. Ford was not along, because if Mrs. Ford was not along, he'd have 2 scoops, not 1. But So I say, so what do the doctors say about the butter pecan ice cream? And he said, damn it, we have it anyhow. He was really full of smuck and full of feistiness. And at that point, Mrs. Ford said, we have had a wonderful quality of life, but now we care about a wonderful quantity of life. She says, now we care about the quality of the life, especially since we know we don't have a lot of time left. And she says, we love the mountains, so we're going. And we'll see how it works. And if it doesn't work out, we'll come back and we'll get a condo in Monterey, someplace where it's cool on the coast, and we'll wait out the desert heat, but we're going. And I kind of admired their in the face of medical science telling them what to do at the end of their life. I really kind of, it was sobering, but I kind of, it was very instructive. And then he said something that I will always remember. He said, when I can't sleep and I wake up at night, he says, I always think of Grand Rapids. And he starts talking about his kids and his stepfather and his real father who abandoned the family when he was 2 weeks old. 70 years later, he was still angry at his birth father. It was just an extraordinarily powerful moment. And at this point, I'm talking about a few things, and he's talking about this, and it's getting pretty heavy. And once again, as she always could do better than anybody with him, Betty Ford saves the day. She says, well, I remember Grand Rapids too, Jerry. She said, I remember how gorgeous you looked in swim trunks when you took me to the beach when we were dating. And Ford lights up and he says, now, Mother, let's don't go too far down that road. But I really loved, I felt like I felt like a voyeur in a good sense, if there is such a thing, because it was really kind of wonderful to see the byplay and to see their lust for life. It was really kind of the aging lion and lioness raging against the fates, and it was really very powerful. And I felt really privileged to be there. And I'm such a dope, or I was such a dope at the time. I couldn't figure out what this was all about until he said to me, well, I'm really sorry to have to throw you out, but I've got to because I need a nap. I never used to have to nap. I now have to have a nap. And he was so frail at that point that he couldn't walk me to the door. First time in 32 years that he had never walked me to the door from an appointment, either his cabin on Air Force 2 or his cabin on Air Force 1 or the Oval Office or the study of his home. Only when I was walking to my car did it hit me that what he was really doing in our first lunch was telling me goodbye. That's what that was all about. But I didn't want to leave it there. And I had a speech, just by coincidence. I got a speech in Palm Springs in the middle of November. And so I knew he was faltering by then. I had heard stories that he was having trouble talking, that he couldn't sign his name anymore, couldn't do autographs. And so since I knew I was going to be in Palm Springs, I was determined to see him. And for the first time in a very long professional association, the body language from his camp was, don't ask. You don't want to do this. Don't hold your breath. But I really was very insistent about it because I knew that if I saw him again, that it would be the last time. And if I didn't see him again, I'd really be upset. And it was very clear that he was in no shape for an interview. This was just going to be a hello and goodbye. And so I was really persistent about it. But after being in Palm Springs 2 days, I still didn't know whether this was going to happen. But the morning of my speech, I got a call from his chief of staff saying, today is a good day, and he wants to see you. Come by. So as we're walking over to the house to see him in the study, the same place that we had our conversation in May, I was told, brace yourself, he's not what he was. And I thought I'd be prepared for this, but I wasn't, because in the study, he was in the study just like in May, but he was propped up in a hospital bed. And he was extremely frail, extremely frail. And I think this is the most powerful chapter in the book. I don't want to go too deeply into it, but it was very poignant. And I will always remember the last words he spoke to me were what they were. His last words were, "Come back again." And that is so classic Gerald Ford. Civil, courteous, gracious, to the very end. And I said to him, "You bet I will, Mr. President. Please take care of yourself." And I knew I'd be back. Actually, I was back on Friday night in Palm Springs. But I knew the next time I came to Palm Springs, he'd be gone. And he was. He died on December the 26th, the day after Christmas. And there are many people very close to him that believe and will always believe that somehow he willed himself to live one extra day so he would not burden his family with a Christmas anniversary of his death. His funeral was held in Washington on January the 2nd of this year. And if ever there were a piece of music appropriate to the person being eulogized that day, it was Aaron Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man, because that's what he was. He was a common man in the good sense of the phrase, thrust into an uncommon situation. And as I listened to all these eulogies, all of them heartfelt and all of them well-deserved, I thought of two things. I thought of a line he used in every speech he gave as vice president. He would always say, "Just remember, I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln." It was a way of lowering expectations, but it was a way of trying to remind people that this was an ordinary guy from Grand Rapids, Michigan, who'd never wanted to be president, who was bitterly disappointed that he was never Speaker of the House. But he was, in fact, a Ford, not a Lincoln. The other thing I remembered at the funeral was something that happened about 5 years before when he was walking me to the door of his home in Rancho Mirage, California, and he says to me, "Oh, by the way, I've just put you on the list as a guest at the funeral, and I'm going to be damn sore if you don't show up." And I'd been saying to him for years that he was going to outlive all of us, and so I repeated this line, and I said, "But you know, Mr. President, if in the unfortunate event that I may be wrong about this," I said, "I would be privileged to attend." And he said, "Good, I want you there," and he changed the subject. And at the funeral, sitting in the same row with Pat Summerall, the broadcaster and football star, Marlon Fitzwater, who a colleague of Roman and mine from the good old days, from the sunny slopes of long ago, as a Texas Ranger captain likes to describe them, and a junior secretary from the Ford White House who was there simply because he liked her and wanted her on the list. Sitting in this row, I just remembered what an ordinary guy he was and what a extraordinary person he was for being an ordinary guy. Simple guy with simple tastes, didn't like ballet, didn't like opera, and didn't care who knew it. Never learned how to use a computer, as I said earlier. He's the kind of guy who would go to the fanciest French restaurant in Vail, Colorado, and break the heart by ordering liver and onions. And Betty Ford once complained to him about this once, and he said, "But I love liver and onions." Lacking in guile, lacking in pretense, same guy in private as he was in public. One of my favorite stories was the night coming back from Tampa on Air Force Two, and he was not a good orator. He gave a couple of really good speeches, but those were the exception, not the rule. He really basically fractured most of his speeches, and this speech in Tampa one night was really bad. So we're coming back from Tampa. He did as usual. He grabbed a martini, he unbuttoned his tie, and he unloosened his tie, and he loosened his tie, and he came up to the front of the press section and sat down and just started shooting the breeze. And after about 5 minutes, he says, "What did y'all think of my speech?" Well, nobody wanted to say what we thought of his speech. So he just kind of looks at all of us and he sips on his martini and he says, "Not worth a damn, was it?" Well, it wasn't, but that's him. Then out came that garrulous, infectious, wonderful Midwestern high-pitched laugh of his that I still remember and I still hear in my mind's eye sometimes. History will sort out his legacy. I think the process is accelerating now with his death. I think he's going to look better in the years to come. I think the pardon cost him the 1976 election. He always thought it was Reagan. He had a case to be made about that, but that's what he thought. I thought it was the pardon. But I think history has decided that the pardon was more of an act of statesmanship than an act of political suicide. I think he did a lot of things during Watergate that he ought to be recognized for. The one that is the most profound to me as a journalist was something that I never appreciated at the time, but I certainly do today. Every time he went out on a trip, and he traveled constantly, he would have a press conference someplace. And these weren't puffball questions. These were questions like, should Nixon resign? Why haven't you resigned in protest to what Nixon is doing? Did you know about the cover-up? Should the Supreme Court, should Nixon be forced to turn over the Watergate tapes? He was constantly being bombarded with very tricky and difficult questions that he had to answer as he was trying to walk this tightrope of friends, trying to be loyal to a friend, trying to be loyal to his conscience, and it was pretty clear to me at some point that he thought Nixon was lying to him personally, and trying to do the right thing for the country and for the party. And having a press conference every trip he took made it harder, but he did this, and he did it, and I think he did it out of an old-fashioned sense of public accountability, which I don't see any of in Washington these days. And in these days, in the era of political spin and message management and control freaks and presidential campaign candidates who have one press conference in 9 months because they're afraid to face the music, I think Gerald Ford's sense of public accountability is well worth mentioning. Sometimes when I'm asked to assess his presidency, I have to stifle the temptation to blurt out the first thing that always pops from my memory bank. And I will mention it in just a second, but it requires a little bit of explanation. Before the scourge of terrorism prompted the Secret Service to close Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House, Pennsylvania Avenue was one of the busiest east-west thoroughfares in town. Tens of thousands of people, motorists, came back and forth in front of the White House every day. And so it was obvious, it was understandable that Pennsylvania Avenue became a magnet for the demonstrators who wanted Nixon to resign. And every day, you'd have a small knot of demonstrators who would create a staging area in Lafayette Park across the street and demonstrate. And they would come to the north side of Pennsylvania Avenue, right across from the north entrance to the White House, and they'd hold up these signs, and the signs said, "Honk if you think he's guilty." And as a young reporter going into the White House every day for a briefing, what I remember most about those days was the cacophony of honking, morning, noon, and night. It continued into the darkness at night. On August 9th, 1974, the day Ford became president, the honking stopped. It stopped. And now I must say that the yakking is going to stop because I have gone on long enough. As I said earlier, I think he was an ordinary guy thrust into extraordinary circumstances. I think that he did the best he could. I think history will be kind to his administration because of what he did for the country. He began the healing process. I think the title of his memoir, A Time to Heal, will end up being his ultimate legacy. In his inaugural address, a classic of simplicity, he said at the very end, "I promise to do the very best I can for America." And I think he did, and then some. Thank you all very much. Thank you. There's one thing that I left out, and I would really be remiss in not thanking my hosts, Britt and Kay Rice, for everything they do for Texas A&M, everything they do for the Bush Library, and for making it possible for to be here. I really appreciate the invitation, and I thank you for that very much. It's as Roman knows, it is never difficult to persuade me to come back to Texas A&M, but it's always nice to have a little reinforcement, and I thank you for that and for lots of other things. Now, Roman, we got time for a few questions if there are any? Okay, let's do that.
Thank you for coming. I enjoyed the book very much.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. DeFrank, you made a comment on page 240 of your book. I just happened to download part of it. Love the information age. I'm wondering if I could read a sentence to you and ask you to comment on it. This is, again, from page 240. The context of the book is you're kind of framing the final days of the president's life. And you say this: inevitably, death watch rumors surfaced. Desert TV stations reported his, and of course his, President Ford's condition, had deteriorated dramatically. The family suspected that the Ford's minister, the Reverend Robert Certain of St. Margaret's Episcopal, was the source. Certain had been asked in writing to stop talking about family matters, but kept, but kept talking. Mr. DeFrank, from personal knowledge, I watched Father Certain deflect press inquiries for over 7 years. And I'm wondering how you substantiated this claim and why you chose to include this paragraph and sully the reputation of a very senior member of the clergy who's also a war hero.
I think he was a war hero, but that's irrelevant to this narrative. I was told for months and for years that Father Certain had been talking about President Ford's medical condition. I was told this by members of the family, members of the staff, time and time and time again. I was told repeatedly that he had been asked in writing to please stop giving interviews in which he described himself as a spokesman for the family. And he continued to do that. I thought it was a fair comment, and I don't have any apologies for putting that in because, as I said, I was told this time and time again by multiple sources, and the family was quite upset about it. And I think that's probably all I want to say. I think it's fair comment. I think it's accurate comment, and I make no judgments. I'm a reporter, not a pundit. I make no judgments on his behavior, but I am reflecting accurately what I was told by a multitude of people very close to President Ford. As I said, family members, staff members, close personal friends, one of whom last night in Grand Rapids made a comment about this without any prompting from me at all. So that's all I can say. Yes, sir.
Mr. DeFrank, I'm a reporter for the Battalion Now, very much interested in going and covering politics and the world of public affairs. I was wondering, you mentioned Washington, the state of Washington today. How can you cut through the message control and the spin and do honest and good reporting? And secondly, as a reporter, and you become very close with an individual, how do you maintain your objectivity?
It's always a very difficult problem. The best thing for a reporter is to really have no relationship at all with the person you cover. When I first got to Washington in 1968, a veteran reporter for the Washington Star said to me, the late lamented Washington Star afternoon paper, he said, I don't want any favors. I don't want an invitation to the state dinner. I don't want an invite to a movie. I don't want to go play tennis with the president or the vice president. I want their handouts. I want them to give me their handouts that they give to everybody, and that way I can read these things, make my own judgments, write based on my own judgments and my own reporting, and there's a complete distance. In a perfect world, that is the best way to proceed, but you do get invitations from time to time. You get invitations to Christmas parties. Not so much these days because there's a real arm's length relationship between this particular White House and the press corps. But it's always difficult. You have to be able to step back and write a story that you know is going to cause some irritation with the people you cover. I mean, one of the things that I liked about Gerald Ford was that he was a grown-up about the press. He understood the value of a free press in a democratic society. And he understood that was part of the game. And he also understood that reporters will, in my phrase, will occasionally bite the hand that feeds them. I can remember a president who once complained to me about some senator who had been very critical of him, and he said what really upset him about it was that he'd had that guy to dinner a month before. that's the way it works. You have to be willing, if you feel your facts are absolutely correct, and they're double-checked and they're triple-checked, and it's a valid story, you have to be able to do that, even if you understand there will be repercussions. And in this day and age, there are always repercussions, because the control freaks are now in charge, for the most part, of the political process, especially the political campaign process. Hillary Clinton has gone a very long time with just one press conference. She doesn't want to get into situations like that, but she's not the only one. And there is less and less dialogue. There's less and less free-flowing dialogue between the media and candidates. I think that's going to get worse, not better. I've said many times, and I've said it a couple times here, that every president and every White House, and for the most part every candidate, decides whether the media is an opportunity to be exploited or a pitfall to be avoided. These days, most politicians and most candidates see the media as a pitfall to be avoided. And I think that's going to get worse, not better, unless you have somebody like Gerald Ford who says public accountability is important. Anybody else?
I was pleased that you cited the 1974, commencement speech that they gave here. There may be some in the audience who hadn't heard that famous line he gave that was very pleasing to Aggies. Do you remember that line?
The line he went. Oh, yes, because I used it in my
background for it.
I used
in Michigan.
I used it in my commencement speech here in May. Aggies are doers, not booers. B-O-O-E-R-S, not B-O-O-R-S. That was the signature line from when he was here. Yes, sir.
President Ford many times had mishaps as he was traveling around the country, and it was hard to come to avoid the conclusion that perhaps he was something of a doofus. In your experience, was that really true, or is it just the fact that those particular instances got all the press?
They didn't get all the press, but they did get a lot of press, I'll grant you that. It really is one of the great anomalies about President Ford, because he could have been a professional football player. He played golf, he played tennis, he was a really good skier. I saw him ski, and he was always doing the expert slopes at Vail, and until his knees had to be replaced and skiing was just a fond memory, he was a really good skier. But he did have, so it is the notion is a little unfair. On the other hand, this was a guy who kept hitting his head on the helicopter. And for every one of those instances that you saw, there were instances that we in the press saw that were not on television. I was there the day in Salzburg, Austria, where he fell down the steps of Air Force One in 1975. He had a great comeback, though. He popped up, shook the hand of the Chancellor of Austria, and he said without prompting, he said right on the spot, he said, I just apologize to the Chancellor for dropping in like this. Great line. So he was a smart guy. He was smarter than his reputation. But this is not just the media making it up. And the other thing is, of course, he was told by his staff, you have to be a good sport about this. And so he was, and he went on Saturday Night Live and let Chevy Chase make fun of him there as well, but he didn't like it. He thought it was very unfair. He didn't say this to me, but he once said to his press secretary, you know, these reporters who write these stories that I'm always falling down the ski slopes, he says the only exercise they get is when they bend their elbow at the bar. And that was an uncharacteristically snippy line from Ford, and that's when I heard that story, that told me a lot about how he tried to be a good sport, but he was annoyed. Do we have time for one more, or are we all done? I think we're all done. Well, Roman, thank you again. Thanks to the Rices. Thank you all for coming and using up part of your evening. I have really had a good time, and I certainly hope that I have a chance to come back here. Again, I'm always reminded of one of my favorite stories about one day President Ford was telling me about going out to do some event at the University of Michigan, his alma mater, and he said, I'm really looking forward to this, and it's going to be on a Saturday. And I said, the fact that it's a football weekend is totally irrelevant and immaterial and coincidental. He says totally coincidental. We are, however, playing Northwestern. So I hope the next time I'm back will be at least on a sports weekend in a year where the team is doing a little better. But thank you for having me. I've really had a good time. Thanks.
Tom, thank you very much for being with us here tonight, and thank you very much for those entertaining yet touching comments on a president who means so much to our great nation and to its history. At this time, that concludes our program. I'd like to thank all of you for being with us. I also like to thank our viewers who are watching this on the webcast for tuning in. I would like to invite our audience now to join us in the lobby for a book signing. Tom will be available to autograph his book and to chit-chat a little bit more. That concludes our program. I would just ask that the dinner guests please remain seated while the rest of our audience leaves the auditorium. Thank you and have a good evening.